Welcome to panel 2 of our conference on environmental health and the law. Again, I'm Professor Jonathan Adler, the Johan Verheij Memorial Professor of Law here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. And panel 2, we're going to focus on the air we breathe and talking about regulation of air pollution and its relation to health. And we really have a great panel of experts to talk on this. First, we will hear from Dr. Michelle Bell, who is Professor of Environmental Health at the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, with secondary appointments at the Yale School of Public Health, Environmental Health Sciences Division, and the Yale School of Engineering and Applied Science Environmental Engineering Program. After Michelle, we will hear from Kathleen Hoke, who is Director of the Legal Resource Center for Public Health Policy and Director of the Network for Public Health Law Eastern Region at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. And then third, we will hear from Janet McCabe, who is Professor of Practice at the Indiana University McKinney School of Law, and who also was acting assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation in the United States Environmental Protection Agency from 2013 to 2017. So I think you'll all agree that we really have a great trio of folks to talk to us about the importance of air quality for environmental health. And so without any further ado, I want to turn the virtual podium over to Michelle, who will begin our conversation.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. Can folks see my screen?
Yep.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm very excited to participate in this conference. I also want to thank the organizers for making such a heroic effort to turn this into a virtual conference so quickly. I'm very excited that we're still moving forward because this topic is so important. And as a scientist who works on environmental health, I view my role is to create work that is policy relevant, not to tell policymakers what to do, but to give them information that they can use to make the most informed science possible. And so today I want to talk about ambient air quality and protection of human health, with kind of the intersection of science and policy, kind of historically how that's been done, in some ways that we're trying to do things a little bit different. So I'm very interested in environmental history, and I just thought I would just briefly remind us of, especially at this time, of an environmental health disaster for air pollution that really got people thinking about this as a critical issue. So many people watching this may already be familiar, but maybe some of you are not. In early December 1952, there was a major event in London where air pollution was so thick that you could not see your hand in front of your face. And this is a photograph. It looks like it was taken at night. It's actually taken at 10:30 in the morning, where a police officer is leading a bus on foot with a flashlight because the air pollution was so thick. So as you can imagine, transportation came to a standstill. The morgues ran out of space for the deceased. Funeral homes ran out of coffins and so on. So this is one of those cases, very timely when we think about it historically in relation to today, about where you had a major event of a condition that caused a major upheaval, in this case localized, in air pollution. And we've since learned through our work that air pollution was affecting mortality outside of this event, but it was really this event that, and many others, that got people interested, these high disaster episodes where the air pollution was so high and the human health consequence was so high that this link became obvious. And I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the local press from 1952. So what were people talking about during the disaster? So you can see here they talk about transportation being stopped, how the milk supply was stopped, wave of robberies, again on traffic and thievery, some information about economic costs, more information about crime, including a judge. Of course, they're highlighting people that were perceived as societally important, more about the economic costs, information about prize cattle being affected. Interestingly, the more prize cattle had a harder time with the fog than did kind of the cattle and the animals that were not thoroughbreds. Worse than other disasters. And so if we look at the information in the press, we see that they were talking about transportation, commercial services, effects on animals, economics, crime, injuries, and human health. And it was really this event based on the largest population, and other events in Denora, Pennsylvania, in the United States and elsewhere that really generated interest between the modern day interest between air pollution and human health for the general public, and for our kind of modern day scientific investigation. The first conference on air pollution and science, human health was held after this event, and also policy. So we can trace the UK version of the Clean Air Act and the EPA regulations for health protection for air pollution to this event, and again, the Denora and similar events in the US. So where do we stand today? Well, we still have enormous problems from outdoor air pollution. And today we're talking about air pollution, but we could also think of many of the policy issues we'll be discussing today as being applicable to other types of environmental exposures as well. But going back to air pollution, we estimate that there are roughly about 3.5, probably I would say a little higher, million deaths globally from outdoor air pollution. This estimate's from several years ago. Most of these are occurring in low and middle income countries, and it's accounting for roughly 8% of the world's deaths. So this is a huge public health burden. It is not evenly distributed. You can see here it's not evenly distributed across countries. We also know that within countries like the United States, these health impacts are not evenly distributed. That is harmful for everyone, but these health burdens are larger on minority communities and individuals, people of lower socioeconomic status, people with compromised respiratory systems, the very young, and the older populations as well. We know a lot more about air pollution and human health, and this is the type of scientific evidence that goes into our policy, or that's our goal. So work from my team and work from many, many others has linked air pollution to birth defects, low birth weight, premature mortality, hospital admissions, and many more. And this type of information gets used directly by the United States EPA, World Health Organization, California EPA, and others to set their standards. So it's always very personally meaningful to me when I see my work or my students or alumni from my team's work cited in these types of EPA documents, such as the Integrated Scientific Assessment for Particulate Matter, where EPA is assessing what is the scientific evidence for an air pollutant and how do we move that into policy. So this is kind of a traditional historical process for how science gets into policy. And up on the left, you'll see a little logo for SEARCH. That's a center, an EPA-funded center we have here, Solutions for Energy, Air, Climate, and Health. So traditionally in the scientific process, we have our scientists making results, and we have policymakers moving from, decision makers making their policy and then protecting public health. And then hopefully we have some results going into the decision makers. And then if we're fortunate, we have scientists communicating with decision makers and providing information into policy. And a lot of times when I read about scientists communicating with policymakers, this is what they're talking about. And this is really wonderful to have scientists communicating with policymakers directly and with the general public directly. I think we can see from today's situation that it's really important that the general public and policymakers understand science and public health. But this is, I argue, not enough. So we're trying to do things a little bit differently. Let me just back up a little bit. Where are the research questions coming from? Well, they're often coming from the scientists, but they are coming from decision makers somewhat, partially through funding sources as well. Like what you can get funded might motivate for what you're going to study, or often we study what we think is going to be important. And let me give you an example of a type of really important scientific research question that we still have that has great policy relevance, just to give you an example of some of the types of things I'm talking about. So we have decades of research on air pollution and human health. I just pulled up several studies for you. Some of these are mine, some of these are other people's. And in these examples, we see a focus on single pollutants. So you'll see ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and so on. And here it's not that the scientists were unaware that the human body is exposed to multiple pollutants simultaneously. It's that it's very difficult to study. So we have all this evidence for single pollutants, but what would be even more effective for policy is if we knew how the body responded to multiple pollutants and mixtures. So we started with an understanding that air pollution overall was important. Think to the London fog of 1952. You had high air pollution versus low air pollution without a strong understanding of what was in this air pollution, to science of single pollutants, to now we're looking at science of pollutant mixtures. It's interesting and important from a scientific perspective because it's more realistic, but it's also interesting and important from a policy perspective. We want to be more effective. We want to regulate the most harmful sources and most harmful types of air pollutants. Okay, so how do we do a better job of interacting as scientists and policymakers? Well, first of all, what we're trying to do at the Search Center and other parts of my team is talk more to decision makers about the research questions. And here at the Search Center, we're talking to state level air quality policymakers. So these are people at the state versions of EPA and associated organizations. There are other types of policymakers we could work with as well. This is just what we've chosen to do. And when I say we talk to them, I meant that we talked to them before the proposal was submitted to EPA. So we developed the research questions that we thought were most policy relevant, most impactful to protect public health, that were also responsive to what EPA wanted studied for their call for the center. And these matched up very well because of course EPA wants policy relevant science. Then we went to these state level decision makers and says, this is the science we think would be helpful for you. Are we right? And they said, for the most part, but they gave us some tweaks, some additional information. So as we were in the hypothesis generating stage, we talked to decision makers. And I argue this is actually highly unusual. Another thing we're doing is when we have interim results, we're talking to decision makers. And that traditional framework I showed you, the results are often handed off to policymakers at the end when the science is completed. And there's a lot to be said for that because policymakers have a harder time dealing with a lot of uncertainty. But we're actually talking to decision makers throughout the project with interim results to see, are we going in the right direction in terms of, are these the right types of scientific questions that are going to be most useful for you? Of course, we continue to communicate with them during the results, and then hopefully we make better policy. And then we also communicate as the policy is being formed to think about how it's going to interact human health. So as you can see, this has a lot more interaction. It's a joint iterative scientific process where we have input at the research questions, a hypothesis stage. We have redirection during the research stage. And we also talk to decision makers about interpretation of results. So we have a scientific interpretation. We also want to hear their policy interpretation, which might be a little bit different or added to how we're thinking of our results. I want to give you just one example of a way this made a big difference in our science, and also talk about how we're implementing this. I'm not going to go through the details of the Search Center. We have 4 different scientific units. We have an environmental data science unit, which deals with biostatistics and spatial statistics. We also have a policy, policy and decision-making unit. This is a group that coordinates the scientists and the decision makers. They're our go-between, and it's led by Professor Dan M.S.E, who's a member of our Search Center, and he is a lawyer who's joint between the School for the Environment at Yale and also the School of Law at Yale. And just to give you an example of how this works, one type of our project is using econometric models in Project 1 to look at how different emission scenarios could affect air quality emissions of air pollution and air pollution precursors, and then that'll go into air quality models and subsequently into human health scenarios and so on. So we have different policy and technology scenarios. So one of the things that we did was sit down with decision makers. This was in person, and we systematically asked them to assess the scenarios that we were planning to study. So this was not just a tell us what you think, but this was a systematic written up survey where we had described to them the surveys, the scenarios we were looking at and so on. And they in general liked our scenarios, but they had one big suggestion. And it's that as scientists, we really like to disentangle different types of effects. So without going into details, you could imagine scenarios A, B, and C, or policy choices A, B, and C. And as scientists, we want to disentangle the effects of different things that are happening. So our project one was modeling them separately. What our policymakers told us is that's not reality. We're really going to have policy A with a little bit of policy B happening, or policy C with a little bit of policy A happening. And we would rather have these combinations of scenarios. We told them, well, then we're not going to be able to run as many scenarios. They said, that's fine. This is more useful for us. So we completely changed how we were doing project one to make it more useful. So this is Dan Esty, who runs our policy unit, and we're meeting with the state decision makers, and we're also meeting with, on the right, those are acronyms for different organizations, like NESCOM is for the New England, Marama is for the Mid-Atlantic, that work with different state agencies to bring them together. I'm going to not read through this, but just talk about some of our ongoing outreach and progress that we've been doing. We do the traditional things of policy briefs and so on, and continue to engage with decision makers, and we're trying to do this nationally as well, right? So just to summarize, this is my last slide. I want to talk about the kind of the things about this policy that worked and the things about it that are difficult. So I want to be honest with you, give you a peek behind the curtain of how this process worked. This is a very unusual way to do science, to have the policymakers so involved. So I'm going to tell you the good news and the bad news. The first thing is I think the good news by far outweighs the bad news. So that's number one. So good news is we have more educated scientists. I feel like everyone on our team, and this is a large 9-institution team, we across different universities and national labs, we know more about how policy interacts with science from a starting point of scientists that do extremely policy relevant science. We have more relevant research. And this is one that I think is really important, especially given today's situation with coronavirus. We have increased trust between the scientists and the policy-making community because we've been taking their input from the beginning. We're making better science. We have more of a relationship with them. And I think that this increased trust between these two communities is really, really important. One concern I had was, are decision makers really going to do this? Because they're not getting paid. We're asking them for their time and their expertise. But we had enormous interest from policymakers. 100% of people we invited said yes. And now some people are approaching us as well. So that has not been a problem at all. Now some of the bad news, which I'll really just word as challenges. We have limited capacity to reach all decision makers, and that's due to being resource limited with our funding and our time. This EPA center is unusual in that there is some part of the research grant set aside to do this type of policy work, but very, very few scientific projects actually have this level of interaction with policies built into the grant. And so in other cases where we're doing it, we're just doing it without funding. And we do need funding to go to these meetings for our time, to hire students to work on policy briefs and so on. And also even for EPA search, because we've had such a good response from policymakers, we're doing way more than what we're funded for. So it's a consequence of the good news, but it's a really resource limited issue. A challenge too is different scientific perspectives and different interests of the decision makers. So we're all doing this for the societal good of public health, but sometimes a state needs to comply with its own state compliance issues for national ambient air quality standards, for example. So they might be interested in showing that their air pollution is coming because they're downwind of another state. And so 2 states might be interested in different types of scientific results. And then another challenge is we are constantly getting requests for information, changes to our science information outside the scope of what we can do, like I need you to investigate this one power plant and so on. So I think the overall good news is that the policymaker community is hungry for this type of interaction, at least that's our experience, but we really don't have the capacity to serve it all. But overall, the good news by far outweighs the bad news. And so I think that this has been an extremely successful experiment that we've run that hopefully has made our science much more policy relevant and therefore made a bigger impact on public health. That's all I had to share with you today. I want to end by thanking my team as always, as well as M.S.E. I really enjoyed I'm still enjoying being director of the Search Center. I want to thank EPA for our funding. If people that are watching this have questions or want to learn more about the Search Center, you see my information there on the lower left. And with that, I will hand control of the slides back over. Thank you so much.
Great. So, alrighty. And next we will hear from Kathleen. You need to unmute.
Okay, there you go. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. That was really interesting talk for me as a non-scientist person, so I really appreciate it. And thanks, Jonathan, for the nice introduction. As Jonathan noted, I am the director of the Network for Public Health Law's Eastern Region. If you don't know the network, you should get to know the network by joining. It's easy and free. You'll get our bi-weekly newsletter by email, but importantly, you'll also get 2 new resources if you sign up for them. Our Judicial Trends in Public Health, which is a monthly report of 10 cases from around the country, federal, state court cases on any issue of public health with some unique public health law issue involved. And again, that comes out monthly. Sneak peek into this month, so it's going to be all COVID related cases. And then that leads to the other resource that we have, of course, which is our COVID-19 resource page. Our Western region, run by James Hodge, has taken the lead, but all of the regions are contributing there. So you will see innumerable resources available there, a series of webinars that we're doing. Emily Benfer, who is on this afternoon's panel, and I will be doing a housing related issues associated with COVID-19 webinar on April 6th. So plug for the Network for Public Health Law, graciously funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And while I don't have an end slide with 1,000 pictures of all the people who have supported me, I do want to give a shout out. As noted, I am also a professor at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law, which means a research assistant really did a lot of the work making this presentation possible. More important than just helping me with the research in the slides, Acacia Foster sat in my office many times, and we went through the voluminous material to decide what we wanted to talk about, which was really hard because there was a lot. So I'm going to get straight on to that. So take a deep breath. From a little bit of just opening these slides, and all of this work was done pre-COVID-19, but of course the issues I'm going to talk about with respect to healthy housing become even more acute in this pandemic because we have taken children out of schools and out of perhaps outdoor activities, and they're spending a lot more time inside their home. If their home conditions are unhealthy, it is exacerbating asthma and other health-related conditions. The same obviously is true for adults. Anyone with any respiratory ailment, like asthma at this time, is at higher risk of severe consequences if they do contract COVID-19. And we do know that one of the top reasons that children visit emergency departments is because of an asthma attack. And now is not a time for a child to be presenting to the emergency department. So all of the issues discussed in this slide, and I think on this afternoon's panel about health equity and housing, are really quite acute in the COVID-19 setting. So just a little bit of data on asthma to set the table here. About 1 in 12 Americans, or 25 million Americans, have asthma in our child population, those under 17. About 8.5% of children have asthma. It is one of the most or it is the most common chronic illness of childhood. It's not just an inconvenience. It just doesn't just require you to maybe not participate in sports or to carry an inhaler with you. It really does lead to significant morbidity and, of course, mortality, with 10 people dying every day. And most of these deaths are preventable. For children, it also includes the trauma, both of an asthma attack and the fear of another asthma attack. Not being able to breathe is a scary thing for anyone, but particularly for a child. Also results in missed school, missed physical activity, as well as, of course, the financial cost, both to the parents as well as to the community. What are some of the residential exposures that we're going to take a look at today, or talk about how to ameliorate today? You can see them on your screen. When we talk about pests, we're specifically talking here mostly about cockroaches, as well as rodents, which have both been tied to causation and exacerbation of asthma in children. Secondhand smoke exposure, which is part of air pollution. But when we look at air pollution, a lot of the issues we talk about with outdoor air contributes to poor indoor air quality. So traffic, bus idling, being in near manufacturing, all of those are going to contribute to negative indoor air quality. Mold and moisture, which is really related also to the structural inadequacies point. If you have leaky windows, leaky roof, appliances that are leaking and moisture is being retained, then we know there's a buildup of mold and mildew. Again, both causative and exacerbating asthma, particularly in children. Structural inadequacies often also lead to deeper pest infestation because they can get in through the cracks and the like. So would not be able to do a talk about housing without raising at least issues of social determinants of health. I'm going to leave to this afternoon's panel to explore it more, but suffice it to say, if you are a low-income renter in an urban area and a member of a minority community, you are far more likely to be living in poor housing conditions. And this is particularly true for children in general. And then those children are, of course, far more likely to be the children who have asthma. So that situates why we should care every day and not just in a pandemic that is bringing to light the severity of many of these issues. So what are the things that we can do as far as environmental interventions in these scenarios? Well, there's a lot of research on different environmental interventions, a lot of evidence base to support both integrated pest management to reduce specifically the cockroach allergen, as well as elimination of moisture intrusion, fixing leaks and removal of any wet or moldy and mildewy items. Significant evidence that those two environmental interventions have immediate and long-term impacts on the health of those living in the properties. So what policies, I'm a policy person, so what policies can cause these interventions to occur? How do we get these things to happen? The rest of the presentation is going to talk to you about big law, statutes, ordinances that can get passed, and what I like to call policy. So sometimes regulatory work, but also small p policy, practices that can be put in place by government agencies, by non-government organizations, and the like to contribute to these problems. So you'll see some legal response that is at the highest level and some legal response. And you'll actually I'll talk a little bit at the end about just community response to address these issues. So from a law perspective, in most jurisdictions, landlords are required to be licensed. And in most jurisdictions, when someone has poor conditions in their rental housing, it is a complaint-driven process. So the tenant has to complain about the property in order to get a health inspection. I think you can imagine why particularly the people in low-income housing are least likely to complain about the poor housing conditions for fear of retribution from their landlords. As a consequence, the complaint-driven approach is not terribly effective. Many jurisdictions, including Baltimore City, my hometown, in 2018 have adopted proactive inspections. These proactive inspections are far more effective in improving the housing quality and do actually reduce the complaints that come in from housing quality. Jurisdictions adopt a practice for how often an inspection needs to be done, typically done by an independent contractor paid for by the landlord, and the form, what has to be done in the inspection is set out by the local government. And so proactive inspections are one of the innovative policy options that can get at making those interventions occur, because the landlord has to make the corrections after the inspection. An innovative inspection model, actually specifically related to asthma, comes out of Boston with the Breathe Easy at Home program. This is a web-based program that integrates the medical community into the process. Health professionals can use this web-based program to refer their patients with asthma, for whom they believe housing conditions are a problem, directly over to the Boston Inspection Services Department, which triggers a home inspection. Again, putting a little bit of a measure between the renter for having to make the complaint, but the physician intercedes and actually makes the complaint, or triggers, I should say, the inspection. Boston does also have periodic proactive inspections. For anyone who's interested in proactive inspections, there is a model policy by Change Lab Solutions out there. One caveat for all of these, if you're doing inspections, whether proactive or complaint driven, the forms need to actually include all of the measures that get at what causes and exacerbates asthma in the home. So moving on to the policy realm. So first, I'll note here, when we talk about smoke-free policies, that private landlords can and often do prohibit smoking throughout multi-unit housing, even in individual units. In some jurisdictions, some local jurisdictions, they do actually have laws that prohibit smoking in individual units in multi-unit dwelling. But here I'm going to talk a little bit about public housing. We started with HUD about a decade ago saying it's okay if public housing authorities want to go smoke-free, so you could, and then they transitioned to actually you should, and then we started to see big jurisdictions like Boston adopting across their public housing authority smoke-free provisions. And then in 2016, effective 2018, HUD announced that all public housing authority properties across the country would go smoke-free. This has had a solid impact. I'm not going to say tremendous, a solid impact on exposure to secondhand smoke in multi-unit housing for public housing authority space. To be sure, there are limitations. Compliance can be difficult. Over enforcement, using there's fear by tenants that their smoking will be used against them. But the interesting thing here is, in overwhelming, in every survey that was done of public housing residents, they supported this policy, and where we see the policies being most effectively implemented are where the community organization itself, the residents themselves, are self-enforcing and bringing cultural change in their building to abide by the provision. I don't think they would have had that same voice but for HUD making the policy, but it's really helpful to have the community base and the HUD policy working together. Now, because my research assistant is a Gen Z person, I have to talk a little bit about some fancy stuff called geocoding. What you probably know is GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Well, geocoding is what GIS does. What this is really looking at are ways that we can use GIS or geocoding to help us with a particular problem associated with the environmental risks associated with asthma in children in their housing. And a really interesting, again, in the interest of time, I'm flipping through my slides, but a really interesting study came out of adoption of a geocoding practice in Cincinnati. So what they did in this Cincinnati model was use geocoding to identify where housing code violations and particular types of housing code violations were occurring throughout Cincinnati. They could then, with that geocoding data, virtually identify particular apartment communities that were far more likely to be experiencing asthma-related housing conditions because of the input data that went into the geocoding of the housing code violations. And in the study, they found that the increased density in housing code violations was in fact associated with population level morbidity independent of poverty. So it was not simply associated with, oh, these are the really poor pockets in the neighborhood. That is where we're going to have housing code violations. That's where we're going to have increased asthma. It was actually independent of the poverty. And children who had been hospitalized for asthma were 1.4, so nearly 2 times at greater odds to revisit the emergency room or be hospitalized within the next 12 months if they lived in that top quartile for housing violations. So if they broke all of the housing violations into quartiles and they were in that top quartile, they were nearly, or they were 1.84 greater odds of hospitalization or readmission to an emergency department. So what does this mean? What does this do? What does that have to do with law and policy, Kathy? Information can really drive resources. And so the local public health agency there, local health providers, local NGOs can get into the neighborhood, assist families with bringing their properties, with working with the landlord to bring the properties up to speed, to explain to parents measures they might take in their properties to prevent their children from having asthma or exacerbation, teaching parents what to look for in their children for signs of asthma, connecting them to care for their children. So it's not a law, again, it's knowing more information, but being able to guide our public health resources effectively. So it's a really, really great study. I'm happy to send the link to folks. It was in Health Affairs. Last thing, very quickly, is transportation policy. As I noted earlier, urban communities are obviously more hard hit by this particular issue. But there's, idling outside. So idling laws can play an effect here. New Jersey does have some anti-idling laws that can impact indoor air quality in urban properties. But one that I thought was interesting when we found it was really something accomplished through community measures. And that was recognizing that that school buses and parents' cars idling, waiting to pick up their children, was creating poor indoor air quality in the school, as well as the adjacent area where the children were discharged to get onto the bus or into their parents' cars, and simply educating the bus drivers and the parents about this and encouraging them to turn their car off instead of idling. Even in cold Cincinnati, this is in Cincinnati again, even in cold Cincinnati winters, to do that had an impact on the air quality that the children were exposed to in their school and as they were approaching their vehicles. So lots of different areas. That's what we call cross-sector work, working on transportation policy as well. And that is, in fact, my last slide, and I think I hit my mark. I need to stop sharing. Okay.
Great, yes.
Let me stop share. There.
Great, and now I'm going to turn it over to Janet.
All right. Well, I'm really honored to be on this panel with these incredible people. And I do sort of feel like my life is flashing before my eyes a little bit, because I have been the beneficiary of the work that people like Michelle Bell, and indeed herself, have done over the years to increase our understanding of how air pollution affects public health. I spent a stint at a small children's environmental health organization here in Indianapolis called Improving Kids Environment, and my life, except for an additional set of issues related to lead poisoning prevention, my life was driven by a lot of the things that Kathleen just talked about. And in fact, Healthy Homes is the umbrella or chapeau for so many children's environmental health issues. I will note, just before I get started, that my husband works with Indiana Legal Services here, and out of the huge new emergency fiscal bill that's come out is significantly more money for legal services organizations across the country, recognizing that poor people are going to be facing particular issues when it comes to employment, debt, and I would argue housing. And we also had an amazing breakthrough here in Indiana where the city of Indianapolis had put in place some more aggressive landlord-tenant protections. I would say that Indiana is on the opposite end of the spectrum from Baltimore in terms of our landlord-tenant law. And there was a state law moving forward to basically stomp on the city of Indianapolis and keep them from doing it. And our governor vetoed that state bill, which I really doubt would have happened if we weren't in this COVID situation where people are paying a little bit more attention to the extra stresses of low-income people in housing situations. So that's some, I guess, a little bit of a silver lining maybe, and not at all what I was planning to talk about today. So I'm currently a professor of practice at the McKinney Indianapolis Law School here in Indianapolis. I also direct something called the IU Environmental Resilience Institute, which is a topic for another day. Would be very pleased to share information about that, but I won't do commercials for that. I have worked as an air regulator here in Indiana. I was the air director for the state of Indiana state agency, with the kind of agency that Michelle talked about. And I spent 7.5 years in the Obama administration in the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, first as deputy to Gina McCarthy when she was assistant administrator for the Office of Air Quality. And then during the second term, I was acting assistant administrator for that office when she got bumped upstairs. Once an air nerd, always an air nerd. I like nothing better than to talk about these sorts of things. I've certainly over the last couple of years been spending a fair amount of my time keeping track of what's going on with the Trump administration and EPA in particular when it comes to air quality. So I wanted to start with just some overall conclusions. They say you're supposed to do that. Air pollution, I would say, is a climate change issue. So I've woven climate change in here significantly. We're at an incredibly challenging time. And even though a lot of the very visible pollution that we used to see in our country that led to fogs and smogs and dirt on people's laundry lines and that sort of thing, we have not finished with our work to address air pollution. A lot of it is stuff we can't see now, but that doesn't mean it isn't impacting our health. I think that many would agree, and I'm advocating the position that we're at a very challenging time for the preservation and support of the environmental protections in the law that we have enjoyed in this country for half a century. And again, the more you get used to something, the less you notice maybe when it starts to get nibbled away at. It's not just changes to rules, those grab headlines a lot, but there's a lot going on that is fundamentally changing, I hope temporarily, the way we do policy in this country, and the very underpinnings of agencies like the EPA. These are changes that in some ways will be much harder to first identify and then fix or rehabilitate, much harder than individual rulemakings, which can be addressed much more discreetly. I don't need to say this last one. I think you all know that it's true. But this is not the first time we've had these hard challenges. And I like to start my talks with a reminder of some of the positive moments in our history. First of all, where this year is the 50th anniversary, not just of the creation of EPA, but also the signing of the Federal Clean Air Act. I don't actually know which document President Nixon is signing here, but it's one of those or something else good. I have to give a little shout out to my fellow Hoosier, Bill Ruckelshaus there in that picture, one of our great Hoosier and in fact, national heroes. But what are some things that we've done in this country where the problems looked intractable and actually through a combination of smart regulation or other policy programs, development of technology at just the right moment, we have really made some headway. This is one of my favorite ones. This is about childhood lead poisoning, blood lead levels in kids. And it shows what happens when you take lead out of gasoline. It just, and what a perfect example of pollution prevention this is. Childhood blood lead levels plummeted when gasoline no longer had lead in it. And there's an interesting story behind that, actually. This one shows how much cleaner our cars are than they used to be. Look at that, that's staggering improvement in tailpipe emissions from motor vehicles. Thanks to technology, thanks to organizations like the California Air Resources Board, EPA, and the auto manufacturers themselves, in fact, and many academics who work on these things. That's not to say we still don't have lead poisoning in this country, or that cars aren't a significant polluter, but so much progress. Here's another one, a global problem that people thought was unsolvable. The effect on the stratospheric ozone layer of chemicals that were used in propellants and deodorants and air conditioners and that sort of thing. The entire world came together a number of decades ago, entered into the Montreal Protocol, and we are well on our way to fixing this problem. This would have led to significant increases in skin cancers and other problems from too much radiation hitting us from the sun. There are a couple of other ones that I think are just remarkable and we should not forget. So back in the 80s, 90s, one of the big crises was acid rain. So sulfates and nitrates, particulate matter, coming from my current part of the country to my former part of the country, because I lived in Massachusetts. I actually got my start on litigation suing Indiana, Ohio, and the Midwestern states to get them to reduce their air pollution. Look at it now. It's just remarkable. And our little friend, the American toad, is oh so grateful because now he or she has safer water to live in. Here's another one that people may not be so familiar with. This is a little bit of an obscure program under the Clean Air Act. It's the Regional Haze Program. Congress said a number of years ago, bravo for them, that human-caused air pollution was impairing the vistas and the air quality in our incredible natural areas in this country. We're so lucky to have them. But sometimes you couldn't see across the Grand Canyon, or it was significantly impaired. Over the years, little bit by little bit, or big bit by big bit, companies have reduced those emissions. Those emissions have often come down because of multiple programs that acid rain and regional haze work in the same way. And so we've considerably improved our regional haze situation. And I can brag about the newest national park, Indiana's first national park. You gotta love a dune called Mountain Baldy, really. This is a slide that every presentation I gave at EPA, I used this slide. We refer to it as the baby slide for obvious reasons, although that baby is probably 40 now. But this is the slide that, that demonstrates that we can have significant economic development and activity increasing, which is all the lines above the 0% line, except for one, while look at the significant reduction in air pollution, 73% between the 70s and 2017. EPA updates this slide every year. The one pollutant, air pollutant, that does not show that kind of drop is CO2 emissions. That's the 23% increase line. And you can see that that tracks pretty closely with economic activity, and in particular with energy consumption. And if you see the little dip in 2009 related to both of those, that is, you are exactly seeing the economic recession. So anybody want to predict what the dips are going to look like for 2020 and 2021 perhaps? We will see that as a result of the experience we're going through now. EPA is actually required under the Clean Air Act to study the benefits and the costs of the programs in the Clean Air Act. And this comes from a study done in March 2011. That's the last time it was done. They're done sort of on decadal cycles. But if you look at the one on the right in particular, look at the disparity, the wonderful disparity between costs and benefits. One of the reasons that the benefits are so high is because of what Michelle was talking about earlier, about mortality associated, and Kathleen also, mortality associated with air pollution. When something actually causes people to die sooner, the costs associated with that are very, very significant. I mean, the benefits that we achieve by not having them die sooner than they would have otherwise. And the costs have turned out in pretty much every case to be way more manageable than were predicted during the rulemakings and during the arguments about those situations. So this is all really super good news. The chart on the left shows modeling to show what the emissions of these pollutants are now with the Clean Air Act amendments and what they would have likely been without the Clean Air Act amendments. So again, amazingly good stories here. So the Clean Air Act during the Obama administration came to be a key vehicle to deal with the newest air pollutant on the scene, which was greenhouse gas emissions. And people who suggested or even accused EPA of setting goals and doing climate policy through the Clean Air Act are only partly right. The reason that EPA was working on rules related to climate change is because CO2 and other greenhouse gas pollutants are considered air pollutants, and the Supreme Court has said so in Massachusetts versus EPA. One of the first things the Obama administration did when it came in was actually make the endangerment finding that led to the decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, because the prior administration had essentially declined to make that, to make a finding. And what EPA did in 2009 was it found that greenhouse gases from mobile sources, vehicles, were emitted in significant amounts and were associated with significant public health and environmental detriments, such that they should be considered to be endangering the public health and welfare. Once that happened, a cascade of required tasks came EPA's way, the first being to regulate tailpipe emissions of CO2. Once EPA did that, those pollutants became regulated pollutants within the meaning of the Clean Air Act, which led to then, do we have to think about these pollutants when new and expanding businesses are going to increase emissions of greenhouse gases significantly? The answer to that was yes. And does EPA also need to set standards for emissions of these pollutants under what is known as the new source performance standard provisions of the Clean Air Act, which is Section 111. I'm not going to talk about the tailoring rule today because it's very complicated. It's a really fun story. But I want to spend my time on other things. So I'm going to do that. And now, there we go. During the Obama administration, these are the primary climate-related rules that EPA worked on. We went in order of significance. So cars and power plants, the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And next in order were oil and gas, which is a methane emitter, landfills, amazingly, also a methane emitter, and trucks. We had an election, and the winning party always likes to say elections matter. It was very easy to see, very quick to see that the new administration had some significant different ideas about many of the things that we had been working on, and here are some of them. There are many, many tools that an incoming administration can use, not just rulemaking, to affect policy. And indeed, one of the things I learned at EPA is that 4 years is a blink of an eye if you want to do major policies or regulatory work. Absolutely, it goes by in a flash. And so if you can find tools that allow you to get towards your desired result, that don't require legislation, don't require litigation, or don't require regulatory processes, those often can be faster. And over the last 3 years, we've heard story after story of things that are going on at EPA relative to reassigning staff or reorganizing offices or changing appointments, all kinds of things that can distract, delay, and change the direction. But two executive orders came out very early from President Trump. One had to do with reducing regulatory burdens. I can offer to you from my experience in state and federal government that regulatory reduction, burden reduction is not the exclusive domain of Republican administrations. Every single executive I've worked with or worked for has asked the agencies to look at reducing regulatory burden. It's a very sensible thing to do. This administration has taken it pretty far. And then the important energy independence executive order. So let me quickly go through a few of these key areas where there's some significant changes. So bye-bye all the climate rules, that's either done or it's being in the process of being done. The good news here is that we did these as rules. This administration has to do them as rules. They will all be litigated. The rush to roll back these rules is leading to, I would say, some sloppy work, some mistakes being made. And of course, there are huge disputes about whether the policies being put in place are consistent with facts on the ground, the kind of information that Michelle Bell puts forward to the agencies. So we do still have the ability to take these rules to legal challenge and to point out either process or substantive flaws with them. The current administration has a very poor record so far in litigation. They are losing way more than they are winning. And that will certainly continue. On air quality standards, the national ambient air quality standards, the major public health protection standards are constantly in review. They're on 5-year review cycles. And there's been a lot of angst about the expert panels that EPA has used to get advice about the processes that folks are using that may lead to less fact-based standards. The mercury and air toxic standards is another incredibly important rule that this administration is looking to not repeal outright, but to undermine. I want to say a word about residential wood stoves. It seems like kind of small potatoes, but it really isn't, and especially if you live next door to one of these things. You wish you hadn't. And this was a rule that we revised in 2015. It hadn't been revised since the 80s, really updating the technology to be much cleaner. The industry was right on the doorstep of the Trump administration asking for extensions of time to comply. The final compliance dates are this year, and they proposed to do so. But in an example of how processes can work even under these circumstances, they just issued a final rule and they declined to extend the deadline, which surprised and pleased a lot of us. But they didn't have the factual data to support an extension. So they did the right thing. So let me quickly see if I can't. There we go. There's a lot of talk about the federal-state relationship. I try not to take these things personally when I would hear Scott Pruitt and others talk about how mean we were to the states. We actually worked with the states a lot. The nature of the federal-state relationship has changed. Frankly, a lot of work that EPA has been doing is being devolved to the states in the name of giving them more autonomy, but no more money is coming with the autonomy. And there is like 90% of the implementation of the Clean Air Act happens at the state agencies. I'm going to just zoom through this, but this is super important, and I'm sure that you guys are aware of what's happening with science and scientists in the agency. It's something that people really, really need to pay attention to and continue to push back on. And they are, including with litigation. So what do we do in this situation? We participate in the public process. If we want to and can, we support legal challenges. We make sure that our elected officials are informed. We demand transparency. We speak up for scientists. And if you have the chance, be nice to a federal employee. It's a very tough time for them now. And above all, vote. There are lots of things going on outside of EPA. Cities are acting, businesses are doing good things. Not right now maybe, but clean energy is moving forward, clean transportation is moving forward, and the public is becoming more aware. Here are just some headlines of great things happening around the country and especially in my state. And let's just remind ourselves that this has been the trajectory for 50 years, despite people saying periodically that the Clean Air Act is a chokehold on the American economy. Clearly, it is not. There are lots of organizations that are tracking these rulemakings, and here are some of the ones that are doing it pretty assiduously. And so I apologize for going over, and I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Since we started a tiny bit late, we have a little bit of time for some questions. I was going to make a couple quick comments. One is for those that are interested in more on changes in the EPA, this past fall, we held a conference anticipating the 50th anniversary of the EPA. Those videos are available on the law school website as well, and the Law Review, Case Western Reserve Law Review will be publishing the papers from that conference. Also, folks may be interested that EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler spoke at that conference, and if you wanted to hear his perspective on the changes, you can see the video of that, and his remarks will be published as well. One other comment I'll make, just I guess a personal comment, was I gave a paper a few weeks ago at a conference at UC Hastings on this issue of federalism under the Trump administration, the Trump EPA. And one of the things in the air quality context that is kind of interesting and at odds with at least some of the rhetoric about cooperative federalism from EPA officials is that the EPA has gone after, for example, California for having a number of state implementation plans that were either out of date or not complete, or not meeting the Clean Air Act requirements, even though the consequences of those failures are quite localized. And then simultaneously, the EPA has resisted efforts to be more aggressive about cross-boundary air pollution. And so if one's argument is that states should have more flexibility and more autonomy, one would think that the agency would be less concerned about requiring states to be more aggressive with localized problems, and that the agency would be more aggressive where states like, say, Indiana or Ohio are having effects on downwind neighbors and preventing downwind neighbors from being able to improve their own air quality. And at least in some respects, we're actually seeing a bit of the opposite with air quality, which is at odds with the arguments about local control that we've heard from the EPA. One question I had for our panelists, in way of kind of tying some of the remarks together, and I'd be curious to hear any of their thoughts on, is what, looking at questions related to air quality, whether we're talking indoor air quality, outdoor air quality, the mix of the two, which we heard a little bit about, how should looking at these specific areas inform our understanding of the way science informs policy, and the way we understand the way better science leads to better policy, and should science education and communication be focused more on policymakers, more on the public, a mix of that? I'd be curious if any of our panelists wanted to reflect on how what they spoke about helps us understand the way scientific knowledge can, or in some cases doesn't, result in better policy.
Hi, this is Michelle. I'm glad to respond to your excellent question. I think that the education of science and of policy should go in all directions. I think that scientists need to be more educated on policy. I think we talk a lot about policymakers being educated on science, but I actually think that this needs to be bidirectional, needs to go both ways. I think that even well-intentioned scientists like myself who try to do very policy relevant research still have a lot to learn. So I know in my scientific training, I took a lot of policy electives and so on. So I considered myself at the beginning of this EPA project I mentioned, I considered myself someone who knows a lot about how science goes into policy, but turns out there was a whole lot I didn't know as well. And also within those electives, those were things that I sought out on my own and sometimes had to get special permission to take a class and so on. So it's not something that's necessarily in our scientific training, even in fields like public health, where the work is designed to be policy relevant. Clearly, we need to educate the public on the consequences of science and policy and what happens when we listen to scientists. In the last presentation gave some beautiful examples of the public health and societal benefit we can have when scientists and policymakers work together to do things like get lead out of gasoline and the enormous benefits. I think most of the general public doesn't understand that the Clean Air Act is one of the most cost-effective pieces of legislation in the entire country's history. So I think it needs to work in both directions. Another just piece of education or issues that I think we should work on are ways in which scientific issues and policy issues interact. I think that scientifically, we're trained, as I mentioned, to kind of disentangle issues so that we can really isolate the impacts of different components. But a lot of these issues are interacting together, and policymakers are sometimes, just by necessity, trying to, hammer down one crisis before they move on to another. But just to give you one example of that is the co-impacts, or sometimes called co-benefits, of climate change and air quality policies, where a lot of actions to lower greenhouse gas emissions would actually improve air quality in the short term, and therefore provide enormous public health and therefore economic benefits in the short term. I mean, like 5-10 years down the road before we even get to a major climate change benefit. So, analyzing these together from a policy perspective and analyzing those together from a scientific perspective is important. So we can provide that information to policymakers, but also for policymakers to think of those together, think of those scientific issues together is really important, because otherwise you're not really getting an accurate cost-benefit analysis, or whatever framework you're using to analyze your policy, you're not really getting a true picture. So those are my thoughts on your important question.
Great. Kathleen.
I just wanted to add one thing. A lot of us are on we're on academic campuses. I happen to be on an academic campus that includes, all of the health professions. So medical school, school of dentistry, school of nursing, school of pharmacy. I'm missing somebody, but school of medicine, if I didn't say that part. Interprofessional education is a big deal for us. So working to bring all of the schools together in a variety of ways. The way I do that is on policy issues. So we have an interprofessional education team on campus, and we bring together once a year a group of students from each of the schools. Really tough to get folks from the med school because their calendars don't tend to align, but so that we can work through a policy issue that's going to be coming before the Maryland legislature with them in interdisciplinary teams, so that I'm able to teach policy, law and policy to them to work together. So that's one way that we can get the future that Michelle, I think hopes to see, is through interprofessional education. The other point I'll just simply make is that I hope that the dip in CO2 that we're going to see in 2021, that we can get that information out to inform policymakers for continuation of things like encouraging, incentivizing businesses to allow for teleworking, right? We know that it's going to work and that we need to incentivize that in some way, and as well as telemedicine, anything that can allow us to still have effective results, but be able to stay home and not have to get in our car and drive back and forth. So telemedicine for chronic conditions is easy one. Maryland did pass a new law this year to open the doors more fully for telemedicine for chronic conditions before COVID. But I'm hoping that we can use that data that y'all are going to get us so that we can make that sort of policy change.
All right, Janet.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things to those excellent answers. One is about language. So I think scientists and policymakers don't use the same language. And as an example, the meteorologists and who ran our air quality monitoring network in Indiana, they talk about, it's going to be breezy today. And we've heard this from the TV, right? And they mean like gale force winds. But they use often, I don't mean to, as everybody does, but scientific or moderating language, and there's a disconnect between how political appointees or policy people think about those things. Likewise, there's a huge bureaucratic mountain of people between the scientists and engineers and fact people and the political decision makers at the top, many layers in between. And the political leadership changes frequently, and the science people have to try to re-educate those people every single time, not knowing, and their backgrounds are always different, and their interest in being educated is always different. So I think that there's lots of opportunities there. And then going the other way, as Michelle was saying, is what research gets done and what questions get answered is really critical. And many people will continue researching the same thing that they have been researching because they're good at it, and there's always more questions to answer. But are those the highest priority in terms of the changing public health demands?
All righty. And Janet, you had your hand up. Was there another issue you wanted to raise, or?
I did. Partly I just wanted to do that little hand raising thing because I'd never done that before. But really, I wanted to ask Michelle, I'm sure that people like her are already starting to think about what kinds of health studies will be done about this period of time where air pollution is going down so much. There are historical examples, like when the steel mill in Salt Lake City went down for 2 weeks or whatever it was, and people were much healthier. Are folks already starting to think about those studies, and what kinds of things are you thinking about?
We have time for a short answer.
The short answer is yes. I've been getting multiple emails since we've been on this call about this issue. So we clearly expect air pollution to go down as things like traffic are going down. There's a lot of other issues, as was mentioned on today's call. It may have been mentioned on today's call how things like mental health are being affected due to isolation. There's other economic impacts on people. People's job situations are changing, stresses of being together, joys of being together. So there are a lot of issues other than the environmental exposures that will need to be taken into account in terms of how they affect public health. So these are some of the various different things, but the epidemiological community and many other scientific communities are already working almost 24/7 on these types of issues. Thank you.
And we are going to have to pause it there, but thank you all for joining this panel. This has been a great set of perspectives on air quality and its role in environmental health. So I'm going to stop the recording here.